What I'm going to talk about is some kind of digging that I've been doing into where did evidence and results come from. Because in the Big Push Forward initiative, we've met so many people who are concerned and worried, and also people who are enthusiastic about the results and evidence agenda. If you read the blog that my colleague Brendan Whitty put on the Big Push Forward website yesterday, where he's been running a survey trying to collect evidence about the politics of evidence, because there's so much as anecdote. It's the stuff of coffee shops and after hours drinks. Not much is written about it, so we're trying to actually bring it out into the open. Look at Brendan's blog, because from the survey, which of course is just as not statistically random as Duncan's one, right? It's just the people who decide to answer. But you'll find that the analysis that Brendan is doing of the 100 or so people stories who've answered is that it very much depends upon your position, where you're sitting in the international development sector. The issue is about international development aid. Now, we're going to find in a minute that it's not just restricted to the international development aid sector, but my concern, and what I'm going to talk about this afternoon, is with reference to, and I'm standing right bang in front of the screen, is to talk about that. And the way in which support to development processes in the sector is being framed at the moment is in terms of technical best practice interventions. That's the framing of what's going on. And it's exacerbating the tendency to categorise and count and objectify people who get treatment. You've seen some of the literature. People get treated as if they're having, as we're going to talk about, as if they're having some kind of operation or being told to take so many pills a day, right? And this technical expert approach to results and evidence forecloses, excludes a recognition of the importance of ideology, politics and values at work in the international development sector. It excludes discussions about how do we understand development. ActionAid staff in Nigeria last week talked a lot about that, how they felt that their understanding of what was development and how to support it was getting squeezed out by a lack of opportunity now even to have a debate about how do we understand development. If somebody is sick, you don't debate whether they're sick or not. Well, you can, but the technical perspective is, oh, they've got malaria, we'll have to cure it. So the more technical the approach becomes, then the less opportunity there is to debate our ideological and value-based position that we all have. And we get to quick win-wins over longer-term change objectives. Again, ActionAid Nigeria told me about how they get money from DFID as part of DFID's good governance program, trying to tackle corruption in Nigeria, and the pressure being put upon them to deliver quick wins, like if you manage to get a member of parliament to stand up and make a statement about corruption in the oil sector, then DFID can give it a tick. Okay, they've been there, done that, tackled that problem. And this is a distraction from the long-term, complex and challenging issues of people, Nigerian citizens, like the ActionAid staff, who are trying to introduce a more democratic and accountable government. Okay, so there's some of the issues against which we're looking at. What am I going to look at? I'm going to talk about the ideological links, because I'm going to talk about ideology. Ideology is a word that's gone out of fashion, so I'm bringing it back into fashion. I'm talking about the ideological links between these two words, results and evidence, and think about them in inverted commas. They have particular meanings at the moment in the development sector, and it's those meanings that I'm going to talk about. They also have wider meanings than in the development sector, so I want to also look at the broader environment in which results and evidence are at play in our own sector. I want us to think about how results and evidence affect the sector's capacity to support social transformation, and to look at why potentially useful instruments, protocols, artifacts, such as theories of change, what is happening that potentially useful instruments mutate into instruments of coercion. What's going on? What is the issues around power that makes that happen? And I want us to look briefly at who are the organisational actors who are actually promoting the results and evidence agenda. So I'm looking at power in a variety of different ways. I'm being eclectic in my theories of power here, mixing up a bit of Foucault with Marx. And this is very much exploratory. So I'm really pleased to be here today to welcome your own analysis and what you can add to what we're talking about. And finally, as I already mentioned, there's a lot of people in the sector who actually are very enthusiastic about what results and evidence agenda can deliver. As was just pointed out in Duncan's blog, 50% voted one way, 50% voted the other way, and another 30% voted confused, don't quite understand. So I'm deliberately being polemical, right? I'm not going to give you a balanced argument. The big push forward is a bit like a mini social movement. So we're making a case. And we're making a case because we think the voice and views and opinions of a lot of people in the sector are being squashed and not being heard. So this is not a balanced academic argument I'm going to give you. On the one hand this, on the other hand that. I could do that, but I'm not. We're in polemical mode at the moment, so you must take that on board. And if you disagree with what I say, you're most welcome. Most welcome. I look forward to it. Okay, so first I'm going to talk about evidence, because I said it's uncovering the politics of evidence. Now, evidence in inverted commas, right? Not evidence in the sense that a court of law uses it, or that I might use it with my grandson when I find that there's a pot of jam is broken on the floor. And I say, all the evidence points to you having broken the pot of jam, right? So we use evidence in everyday language, but it's got this particular meaning now in the development sector. And it's this meaning of what works, this very popular phrase that has entered the sector. What works or doesn't work? And this approach to evidence comes from medical research. It's looking at how in medical research does this particular drug work better in curing a certain disease than another kind of drug. And medical research would do a randomized control trial and give drug A to one group and drug B to another group, and then decide, drug A works better than drug B. And all well and good. I really welcome it. We all welcome that. I'm a beneficiary myself of modern medical research, so I'm not denigrating it. But what's happened is this modern medical research approach to evidence has just been picked up and put into the development sector. So, what's happened is that the how and the process of how change happens, and all the multitude of actors who are trying to support or oppose how change happens, all that gets lost. We're just looking at medical research. You have a controlled environment. That's the whole idea. You have a controlled environment so that you can test the efficacy of the drug. But development is not a controlled environment. It's a chaotic, complex, and unpredictable environment. it assumes a linear cause-effect. This tablet, this drug works better than the other tablet for particular reasons and associated with the human physiognomy and the chemistry and biology of ourselves and interaction with the drug. But once again, as I said, change doesn't happen like that. There's no necessary linear cause effect in the complexity of corruption and bad governance in Nigeria. So when we look at evidence that way, we're tending to look at it as if it's kind of a bounded, medical, controllable problem. And the effect of that is an increasing tendency in the sector only to fund and support problems that can be framed in this way, or to look for evidence which is spurious evidence, like a member of parliament speaking for what in the National Assembly in Abuja, and that's evidence that corruption's being tackled, when it's possibly not evidence at all of that. And as I've said already, it deflects attention away from the ideologies and values that shape and inform policy and programming. Results, that's the other one. Results is what you can count and deliver. Sorry, there's a typo there, I realised. And whereas evidence comes from the medical sector, results comes from private sector accounting. And whereas evidence in the medical meaning is only about 30 years old, results has a long history. Value for money and performance-based results, PBR stands. Value for money and performance-based results were alive and well in mid-19th century Britain and the United States. And payment by results was used in the education system to pay school teachers, depending on the results which the children got at school, right? And of course, all the teachers falsified all the results. The children didn't learn anything, and there were enormous bureaucratic red tape for all the monitoring and control. So after about 30, 40 years, it became apparent to everybody that this was just bad for educational objectives. It was very expensive to run, and it didn't work. So they abolished it. And believe it or not, in the UK last year, the Prime Minister said, we now have this marvellous new approach that will really deliver results. It's payment by results. Other words for this are cash on delivery, things like that. So he'd forgotten, if he ever knew, that they tried it out in the 19th century and it didn't work. Even on its own terms, it didn't work. In other words, it didn't make the system more efficient or effective. Okay, so MBO, so it all came back in about the 1960s from the United States. Management by objectives, cost-benefit analysis, and then by the 1990s we were getting results, and value for money was coming back in, and then payment by results is now the latest fashion again. So this is not a new challenge. Now, I'm not talking about the development sector here. I'm talking about the more general, what's happening in the public sector. So what's my critique? Can you read what he's saying, everybody? Yeah. This is where we started to draw taller bars to please you guys. Right. Okay. If you demand results, people will deliver results. But it may have nothing to do with the reality of what's going on. And of course, it can have very perverse consequences. There was a case last year, very recently, came up in the UK, of there was, I think, if I recollect correctly, a certain police force had a target. They had to deliver on a certain percentage of all crimes had to be solved. And so, particularly when women came to report domestic violence crimes, they persuaded them that there was nothing to report. Right. So in other words, they were persuading people not to report crimes so that they then didn't have the problem of having to solve them. As soon as you establish results in this way, this is the kind of thing that happens. And as I've already pointed out, you lose the focus on what it is that you're really trying to change. What are the real objectives that you're trying to achieve? So, evidence and results they're part of the same family, actually. They're well linked together. They're part of the same paradigm, if I can use that word. What do they have in common? Well, they have this common understanding of causality, which is a kind of linear, if you do A, you'll get B, which will result in C. It doesn't recognise multiple potential pathways of change and complex feedback loops that make things go off in a different direction. An assumption that evidence pertains only to measurable facts and other kinds of knowledge have no value. At the Big Push Forward conference that we're having next month in IDS, we have somebody coming from Bangladesh who interestingly pushed back against a systematic review. She was commissioned to do a systematic review, and which is very precise, these systematic reviews, which also come from the medical discipline, in which what is acceptable as evidence is very narrowly defined. And she pushed back and said, we want to include in the evidence the voices and experiences of women's groups in Bangladesh that have been collected by themselves or been collected by anthropologists or participatory research. And they said, no, you can't have that. She said, if we can't have it, we're not going to do it. And she won. They said, all right then. So I really like this story. These are not all stories of getting oppressed, right? You can push back against the narrow framing of evidence. As I said, it's reductionist. It's an approach that treats people as not as citizens with voice, but patients needing treatment. And perhaps the most difficult, it lays claims to being objective. The whole philosophy is to get rid of bias, to produce objective evidence without bias. Now, actually, I am biased. I think, oddly enough, I would suggest that I'm less biased by admitting to bias than people who say, no, we're totally objective, there's no bias. When you say there's no bias, we're objective, that is when power is really at work. Power hides itself. Power makes itself invisible through claims to lack of bias, to pure objectivity. So that's what's going on in the big world out here at the moment. And some of you know this cartoon, but I love it because I actually think you don't need me speaking to you for half an hour, so everything's said here. So, these discourses of results and evidence are permeating much of the world, particularly the Western world at the moment, and particularly the Anglo-Saxon part of the Western world. Why have they become so influential in the development sector? These are just suggestions, and I'd welcome suggestions from you about why they become so influential in the development sector. I think one reason is because there's a real urge, it's a psychological phenomenon, it's pathological, actually psychopathological. If there's a psychologist in the room, I'd welcome the actual technical term for this. But it seems to me that funding agencies working in the development sector, everything is so dynamic, complex, unpredictable, you're definitely not in charge. And a psychological reaction to this becomes a desperate attempt to be in charge, right? To control an environment that you can't control. So instead of going with the flow and saying, right, we're not in charge, but let's see how we can be useful, They've constructed a whole model, a whole paradigm of pretending to be in charge, of making a reality which isn't there. Recently, a former staff member of a large bilateral agency, which will remain unnamed, was telling me she worked on education programs in a fragile state. And she, with a number of colleagues, had a meeting with the executive director where he was reviewing whether to fund a big education program in this state. And he said to her, "What's the unit cost of educating a girl through primary school?" And she said, "I don't know." And he said, "What do you mean you don't know?" And she said, "Well, it's impossible to have that kind of data in that context. You know, it's just not there." He said, "I want that data. If you can't give me that data, we're not going to have this program. Go away," sort of thing. And as she got very angry with her, and she looked around at all her colleagues, and they were all just looking down at their lap, right? So after the meeting was over, she said to her colleagues, "Why didn't you support me? Why do you know? You agree." They said, "Well, you're just very silly. You should have just given him a number," right? So she didn't. She refused to give him a number. But most people, most of the time, will give him a number. And as they give him numbers like that, they're constructing his unreal world, where the world very different from the real world in which he's at work. But everybody's helping senior staff live in a world of fantasy. And finally, politics of accountability. This results and evidence agenda's got much stronger in the last few years, and arguably because most of donor countries are under pressure on their domestic budgets. They're under pressure to cancel their support to development. And therefore they need to produce rapid, quick wins, spurious results. Although it's arguable whether really those citizens in donor countries who don't want to support poverty reduction and fighting injustice in poorer countries, whether they care one way or another about these figures. But these are the figures that ministers like to stand up in Parliament and report on. Okay, these are some of the tools and protocols. I thought it was worth kind of separating the results ones from the evidence ones. The evidence ones is what you use in order to justify funding and what you use to evaluate what's happened. So we've got all these justification ones from RCTs right through to business cases. The results ones are more about the actual design process and monitoring as you go along what's happening and the logic of design. Of course, there is some overlap. I asked Action Aid staff last week how many of these they used, and they burst out laughing and said, all of them and a few more. They generate themselves, they self-reproduce. It's very interesting. It's some process of self-generation. And they're instruments of power. These tools and artifacts are not innocuous. This was a workshop I did with AusAid, a colleague and I did with AusAid last year. And one of the AusAid staff drew this on a bit of paper. So I asked her if I could use it, and she said yes. Someone feed me. Right. And increasing number of staff, even in the donor agencies, they're just feeding the results beast. So what's the effect of these tools and protocols? Because the discourse of results and evidence has generated... The discourse doesn't hurt us. On a day-to-day basis, it's the tools and protocols, what I'm calling the artifacts. Those are the ones that actually have real-life material effects on how people go about their work in the development sector. What they can do, what they can't do. What kind of programs get funded, what kind of programs don't get funded anymore. So these tools and artifacts have real-world material effect on people. And what is that effect? Compliance. Even compliance in absurd situations like the story I told of this education advisor, right? But also resistance. It's the other side of compliance. People resist. They resist in various ways. They might kind of agree to design and implement a program in a certain way, but among themselves they say, well, that's just the kind of shell. What we're really going to do is what we really know we need to do. So you often get that kind of resistance and compliance married to each other. Incidentally, it consumes a lot of energy. If you're reporting one thing and doing something else, it consumes a lot of energy. Energy which you then haven't got into doing what you really want to do. Fabrication. I was at year before last, early last year. Anyway, I was at a conference in London on results. This conference was being run by KPMG or PricewaterhouseCoopers or something. And so they thought they'd better have one of their speakers who they thought might be challenging the general environment in the room. And there were about 300 people there, largely consultants, independent consultants. So I asked them to raise their hand if they'd ever lied in their reports. And about 60% of the room put their hands up. Right. The others lied. Yes. They were more nervous. They thought their boss was in the room. Yes. So we all know there's an enormous amount of fabrication going on, but nobody's allowed to say it. Right? And indeed, sitting on the panel with me was a staff member from a official donor agency, who was very cross and said, "How dare the speaker next to me accuse everybody of being liars? It's not true." That was even funnier. Now, and perhaps the most serious effect is internalization. We internalize it, so it becomes natural, common sense to us. And then what do? We then take these tools and instruments and protocols and we make other people use them. It becomes like a cancer through the system. And sometimes we don't internalize it, but we have no choice. And I think there's a whole large group of people. And when I showed this slide to Action Aid staff in Nigeria last week, they all said, yes, that's us. We're the squeezed middle. Because they have increasing number of obligations coming down on them from on top, right, to report back in terms of certain quantifiable numbers, quick win results. They spend most of the time filling in bits of paper. They have to go to their local partners, who in turn have to go to communities to try and get some of this stuff. But the more time they spend on collecting this stuff, the less time there is to do that long-term, much kind of slower, complicated, relational kind of work with people in communities that they want to do. So they try and protect the communities and their local partners from what's being pushed down the system. So they're feeling squeezed and losing energy and enthusiasm for their work as a result. So I'm arguing the effects are really very damaging on people who are trying to work for transformative development. Just quickly, who's promoting these? Now, it's definitely an Anglo-Saxon phenomenon, right? But the trouble is, in the development sector, what starts in Anglo-Saxon countries has a horrible habit of going everywhere, right? Partly because of the English language, because the Anglo-Saxon intellectual tradition is very empiricist. You don't talk about epistemology or ideology or anything like that in Anglo-Saxon tradition. So really, one of the one of the things the Big Push Forward is trying to do is trying to encourage non-Anglo-Saxon societies and organisations working in development to immunise themselves, if I dare use a medical term, to jab themselves against what's coming, right? And it's creeping in, even here in Switzerland, if you look at some of the SDC documentation, and even then they're beginning to get infected. So you have to kind of warn yourselves, look out, I'm going to get infected if I'm not careful. Accountancy companies, the very large accountancy companies, they're getting more and more influential and important in the development sector. And they're bringing their idea of results in terms of the bottom line, profits, what you can count. I'm using Mike Edwards' term of philanthro-capitalist foundations. The Gates Foundation is particularly influential. It's amazing ideological and intellectual influence, which is much more significant than even the money it spends. And then it's kind of set parts of the development research community, where I come from, and the evaluation community really like it. It gives lots of interesting work. Evaluation has become a much more central theme. In the bad old days, evaluation units were always in the attic or the basement or in some other part of the country away from head office. And nobody took any notice of evaluation. That was awful. That was terrible. But now evaluation's become much more important. And there's lots of jobs, right? And there's lots of enthusiasm. So when that happens, you get a kind of self-generating. So the challenge here now is, okay, what kind of evaluation? Okay, so that's a big push forward. Those of you who don't know it, please do visit us. I haven't put the website there, but anyway, it's easy enough. It's www.bigpushforward.net, right? Or if you just Google Big Push Forward, you'll find us. So, in conclusion, I'm suggesting that social development and poverty reduction are primarily political issues involving power and ideology and values and unequal relationships. It's not that technical things can help, but you're only going to get, in any case, those technical improvements if power relations shift so that people can actually benefit from technical improvements. And I'm also saying that in the past, the international development sector did provide opportunities for people working in the sector who wanted to support transformative development, including here at UNRISD, right? UNRISD has had some brilliant programs in the past, and I know is finding it harder and harder to run and work with colleagues and their networks throughout the world on those kind of programs that are really asking questions about social transformation and power. So what we need to do is actively work together to try and protect the space that we used to have and to push back and forward in order to create that space again.
Thank you very much.